Once a daring experiment in publishing, comic books have come a long way since their humble origins nearly a century ago. The comic book industry has grown tremendously since the first pulp comics were published in the 1930s, with recent data suggesting that, from casual readers to diligent collectors, more than 40% of the US population alone reads comic books. The industry has since spread into modern digital media, with the major publishers growing into veritable media empires. It's a billion-dollar business now, and that's not counting the books, games, toys, TV shows, and movies that all tie in. Hundreds of thousands of fans gather at comic conventions across the country every year, all eager to meet their favorite artists and writers, pouring their dollars into the industry coffers too. Of course, as with other mass media, it's only been in the recent past that we've seen any real queer representation and diversity coming from the comic book industry. Long-term fans and lovers of comic lore will recall that, until 1989, the Comics Code Authority, a self-policing industry group, didn't allow any suggestion of queer content in mainstream comics. Even indie presses tended to shy away from comics aimed at an LGBTQ audience until the 1970s. This shouldn't come as much of a surprise, though, considering that the history of comic book development, again like most pop culture mass media, was made by and for straight white men. Since the 1990s, though, and especially into the 21st century, diversity and queer representation from both mainstream and indie comic publishers has grown significantly. The advent of both on-demand and web publishing has made the creation of comics much more accessible, too. But has it been enough? Is the industry even on the right path? What more could publishers and creators do to ensure representation of the queer community along with other diverse communities in the pages of their latest works? First, let's talk a little bit about what queer means.
Being queer means being able to be myself without fear of someone doing something bad to me. And it's hard, right? It's really hard in this time and this politics.
Living openly and honestly, typically in most circumstances, either loving someone of the same sexual orientation as you or gender identity as you, or maybe even not, and just living openly and honestly however you choose.
It pretty much just is all-encompassing of anything that is not perfectly heteronormative, heterosexual, cisgender. Anything outside that extremely rigid box, I think, can very easily fit into the queer umbrella.
Open minds, it means a little bit of fluidity in terms of your own kind of concept of your own sexuality, and also just being more aware and understanding of other people and how their sexuality evolves. So though I'm not genderqueer, I definitely, I would never say no to those impulses should they find me.
Anywhere on the spectrum that isn't defined as heterosexual, cisgender, I throw cisgender in there as part of the queer spectrum because queer kind of encompasses a lot of gender bending, and a lot of trans people go through queer community before they actually come out as they're figuring out their gender identity. Although I want to point out that gender identity and sexual identity are not, in fact, the same thing. They're on different axes, but it tends to get discussed within the same space.
It's everything outside of, what's that word? The heteronormativity. So it's just whatever bodies are smushed up against whatever other bodies, and they're just all doing it. And if you can look at it and be like, that's not 100% straight, then to me that's queer.
Any type of affection or love for something that doesn't represent the norm, something that doesn't represent something that's typically considered by society to be atypical.
I do a comic called Ojoy Sex Toy with my husband, Matthew Nolan, and we do sex education, and we try to explain, like, this is how your body works, and here's what to do if you get an STI, and it's not the end of the world, and here's how not to get pregnant, and here's what to do if you had unprotected sex, and, like, I'm trying to make the comics that I needed when I was learning about all this stuff to just kind of destigmatize and demystify a lot of it, and then there's also sex toy reviews, so get get to try out a lot of fun stuff and then tell the internet what our experience was. My husband and I commission artists to make stories just for us, and they're autobiographical, they're fictional, they're educational. It's just a wide variety, and so we run a whole bunch of guest comics from a wide variety of people.
I'm a comic book artist based out of San Francisco. I'm working on a book through Oni Press right now called The Black Mage. It's basically, imagine Harry Potter, but instead of Harry, it's the first black student to attend Hogwarts, and Hogwarts is run by the KKK. It's pretty intense. It's pretty intense. It's funny. It's humorous. It's all video game references, shonen anime references, and all that good stuff.
I'm an editor and writer mostly. I'm doing these Cartoon Network books for the Adventure Time series from Boom Studios. The new one, Brain Robbers, is out this week. And then I'm also a writer of romance comics. I do a series called Love Machines that's all love stories about technology. Bicycles, vending machines, computers, smartphones, an iron lung, a mannequin. And then also I'm a lifelong gamer. So I edited the anthology Death Saves, Fallen Heroes of the Kitchen Table. And that's a love letter to all the characters I've killed off as a dungeon master over the years by getting some of my favorite creators to tell stories of their favorite characters and how they died.
There's clearly some variety in people's definition of queer, although most definitions seem to exist within a similar framework, in that queer people sit outside of current cultural norms around sexuality or gender identity and expression. What do people say then when we look at a broader idea of diversity and inclusion?
Diversity means that everyone is welcome at the table, whether you have any experience in geek stuff, whether you have tons and tons of experience, is that everybody is welcome to the table, is that you can play games, you can be in love with whatever, that you can cosplay whatever you want, that you have a safe space where you feel welcome to be yourself, and that those of us who are at a point of privilege is that we are magnifying those voices of marginalized people, that we are bringing them to the table and not just waiting for them to come to us.
That you have basically more than just white people on on games and media. I feel like growing up in like a white suburb, I felt like a lot of times part of me was represented, but never like the Asian part of me. And so coming to cons where you have like a lot of diversity at it really makes me feel comfortable, and I like it a lot because I see myself in a lot of the media and comics that you see with diversity in it.
The inclusion of every viewpoint as expressed by people who hold those viewpoints through experience, and the understanding that that is a valuable part of what the output is. Like a person who has a different lived experience than you, for example, that what they might have to say about a certain story or a certain political stance may have insight that you personally lack, not through malice on your part or not necessarily because you don't care about that person, but just because it's something that may not have occurred to you as an issue or something that you might have to consider as part of the greater whole.
I do comics primarily, and I do a lot of auto-bio stuff. I do a lot of biographical work. And I also do fantasy and sci-fi. I do monsters. I do a bunch of different things, kind of whatever is most interesting to me at the moment. The stuff that I'm probably most known for is the biographical and autobiographical stuff. I just had a piece go up on the Nib on Friday, and that's my second piece for the Nib. And I had an autobio piece on Fusion that won an award for National Gay and Lesbian Journalist Association. So that's definitely the stuff that people actually are probably most associating with me. But I also really like sci-fi and fantasy because I like making stuff up.
I run Iron Circus Comics. It was founded in 2007 as primarily a self-publishing imprint. It has since massively expanded scope, starting in 2012, and now it publishes what I consider strange and amazing books. I kind of take that philosophy to heart when I decide what I'm publishing, and pretty much everything I publish does it appeal to my personal tastes? Is the answer yes? All right, great, let's publish it. And that has yet to fail me, so I rely on my personal sense of what's interesting and what's worthy. And needless to say, it tends to skew towards stories and genres the other publishers aren't really considering right now. A large part of that is erotica. And while there is a ton of comic erotica out there, the stuff I publish tends to be overwhelming majority made by women, which there's a ton of women who are making erotic comics, but in a professional format, not as many. So I'm publishing erotica by women in a professional format, and that has been a massive success for me. So I publish a whole lot of stuff, a diversity of genre and a diversity of talent and a diversity of theme. And by and large, like I said, I let my taste determine what goes to press. But fortunately, to date, the public seems to agree with me about what's worthy of being read.
Diversity is really important to me, and that's kind of why I've been trying to put it in some of the games that I create. So this recent game that my partner and I have made, Food Truck Champion, not only has diverse foods in it, because I like food and I feel like that is a great way to connect with people, but it also features some different ethnicities in our food truck owners. So I actually went out of the way to say that when we signed this game over to Daily Magic so they could publish it and produce it, that we would have to keep the Filipino food truck. Because that's not something I've really seen in a game at all. I haven't seen another Filipino represented character that I can think of in games, and so I am really excited to be a game that actually features Filipino food and food truck and person prominently.
The question remains then, given the recent advances we've seen from the comic industry around diversity and inclusion, do different types of people see themselves represented in comics?
I'm seeing a lot of progress in the sense that I'm seeing more and more comic book characters that are queer or identify as like lesbian or gay, and I still think there's a lot of work needs to be done because there aren't a lot of Latino comic book characters, and definitely not a lot of queer Latino comic book characters, but I do feel like they're trying.
As far as like straight males, that's like the main thing in industry nowadays, but I guess with Asians, it's disappointing. It's disappointing because they cast Scarlett Johansson as the lead in Ghost in the Shell, and they cast Tilda Swinton as a Tibetan monk in Doctor Strange. So they're failing Asians as far as representing us.
Not a lot, especially because I'm older. And so, especially like I used to work in video games, and a lot of people thought I was too old, especially representing games on live streaming and things like that. So I find a lot of ageism in gaming, especially in video games. But it's nice to see like Overwatch has an older woman character. It's nicer to see women with more body types. It's nicer to see myself because representation is extremely important. It's nice when you have like Guild Wars 2 has a disabled character. It's wonderful to see representation in the media that we consume.
Not a whole lot. I read like Young Avengers and like, yeah, I'm not like mainstream, not so much. But like I read some of these guys. I have that book over there.
I'm seeing it more in small press. I follow a couple of comics that feature trans characters. I'm seeing it on color lines increasingly with some of the bigger things like Ms. Marvel, the gender swapping of Thor, the Latino Spider-Man. So, we're making progress slowly but surely. I really struggle to find books by women and women of color and people of color. And that's always great when I can find that. And if it's an entire creative team, that's not a bunch of straight white cis dudes, that's even better, but that's also rare, unfortunately.
There are a surprising number of bisexual characters in comics, though it's not always clear unless it's not always obvious when they're being presented or when they're not. Usually I have to look up on a Wikipedia article and there is a coincidental historic reference and almost none of them are male. But it is good to see a little bit of representation, and in the queer and indie comic space, there's a lot of representation.
I feel like it's doing a really good job recently. I've at least of the comics that I follow. I like Wicked and Divine. I've seen a lot of like Asian characters in some of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I still feel like there's more that could be done, though. I don't see enough like Asian or even mixed Asian characters, I feel, in like the spotlight. You have all those whitewashing that's been happening with like some of the films like Ghost in the Shell and stuff like that. And I would really like to see just, I guess, Asian actors be like kind of the next like main superhero or like main title person of a film or a comic. that I like.
So I might be biased because most of the content that I consume does have to deal with characters of color or characters who represent the spectrum, but I do see a lot more representation in comics and more acceptance of characters in comics who do represent the spectrum or who do represent people of color, and people being more comfortable with seeing that in the content they consume. Because I do remember, when I was growing up and thinking like, why aren't any of these X-Men representing someone that I would want to have a romantic relationship with? And I remember when Bobby Drake, when they wrote him as a gay character, and me thinking Iceman's gay, like how cool is that, pun intended, and just knowing that would be okay, that some kid would read that and think one of these major characters represents someone that I could be. We have a long way to go, but it's nice that is something that can happen in my lifetime.
A lot of people ask me about, like mainstream attempts to improve diversity of characters and creators in the industry. And I think it's good for the most part. I think the creators part is much more important. I don't think that only queer people can tell queer stories, but I think that your odds of getting a good story are much better when you have diversity behind the scenes. Keep looking for the independent comics, because those are the ones that are going to give you the honest, daring, cutting edge, awesome stories, and then the mainstream will catch up eventually. But if you're in the know, you get the indies, because then you're going to get there sooner than everybody else. You're going to be like the people who read the Game of Thrones books before they watched the series, like sitting there all smug, waiting for that red wedding. You could be that person.
I see a lot of representation. I mean, I know I'm a white woman, so seeing representation of myself is not that hard, but I would say definitely within the last 5 years, there's just been a fucking boom of people doing independent comics with all kinds of queer women just being queer and being women all up in the place.
I see Marvel really paving a lot of way. They're doing a lot of stuff, hiring me to work on Red Wolf. They're bringing in straight, and they're taking steps with gay characters. They're making native characters. They're making more ethnic. They're recognizing that there's more than just the typical stereotype hero, female or others. And that's cool. It is showing that there's growth, and the kids that see that, they're reading those books, they're going to grow up seeing, okay, a hero isn't classified as a square-jawed type. He could be somebody else. He could, could be a girl, could be a boy, but it doesn't really matter anymore. It's breaking those walls down.
Every once in a while, a bunch of white guys get together in a room and say, you know what's hot right now? Diversity. And they write a comic about a brown girl, possibly disabled, because, get as many of those check boxes in as you possibly can. And it's written by a white guy, and it's drawn by a white guy who doesn't actually know what kinky hair is like. So he colors it in and inks it in, so it looks like a koosh ball. Does anyone even know what koosh balls are anymore? But it looks like that. And then they publish it, and it runs for 6 issues, and they pat themselves on the back and go back to what they were doing before.
I'm seeing queer identities being represented best through independent comics. There have been a lot of really great independent artists and writers producing their own work, mostly because I don't think we're seeing a lot of ourselves in the mainstream industry. There have been attempts, obviously, through the larger publishers and film studios to, sort of introduce queer characters, but it usually comes at we're still the sidekicks, we're still sort of token characters. But I think independent artists were kind of deciding, like, if we want to see ourselves in these stories, we have to start writing and creating our own work. And I'm seeing a lot more of that through comics and film and television. The queer comics culture is really strong right now. I think it's only getting stronger. And I think there's a lot of amazing work out there that is getting discovered every year.
I see the comics industry changing slowly, but surely. We're seeing a lot more queer creators at the helm of a lot of projects of major publishers and major outlets. So we're seeing characters becoming queer arcs of characters happening, and more discussions around queerness, homosexuality, bisexuality, all that good stuff happening in comics now. So we're getting through kind of the coming out phase of comics is what we're doing right now, is what it seems like to me.
Well, it's really nice to see not only a lot more queer characters and sometimes even bi characters, but we're seeing a lot more trans visibility these days, which is really important. And it's slow, but it's going slowly but surely. And it's always really heartening when you see characters who are more like you and are not necessarily just a tragic figure or a villain or something to watch out for, and is just like a normal person and has one of these traits, and it's fine, and the story doesn't even have to be about that, although it's great if it is.
The vast majority of the work that's actually representing my identity and the things I care about is being done in webcomics and in self-publishing and in small press. In as much as mainstream industry is doing it, it tends to dip a toe in there. It tends to be very much focused on lip service, but there's not a whole lot of deep dive into stuff that I actually care about. And I think a lot of the really interesting stuff is actually being done more by independent artists.
My work is coastal Salish based. It's not pure form line design. I take liberties with it, but the idea is to show the native heritage behind it, but also show my love and passion for the characters that I'm portraying. That I'm just a big geek, a big kid, and I still love doing that. But I'm also Native American, so I want people to see that aspect of my life as well. It's important to me.
I have a long passion for comics, and I've slowly been working my way into doing more and more comics, and I've had the experience, really great opportunity to work with a lot of great queer creators. For instance, the Beyond Anthology, which is queer sci-fi and fantasy anthology series. I did the cover art for their first volume. I'm working on the second story in the second volume, and the response to that has been incredible, and we're really excited about Volume 2, which will be coming out within the next year or so. And I'm currently working on a queer Revolutionary War romance comic with Josh Trujillo, who's the creator of Love Machines. And we wanted to explore the, kind of examine the, speculate as to what would it have been like to be a queer person in colonial America during the Revolution. Because there's a lot of queer history out there that hasn't been told and could never be told for obvious reasons, but we're kind of imagining, like, what would it be like to be queer during the American Revolution?
My work isn't super gay, unfortunately, but it's just kind of incidentally queer because it's autobiographical, so it's about me, and I'm gay, and I don't self-censor at all, and because my work is a lot about my experiences and just what I'm feeling as I'm going through things, that's going to, the gay side of me is going to just come up as part of how I feel about things. And, people have mentioned to me, like, I've got this book about, it's a travelogue about a couple trips I took to Iceland. So it's not really about anything gay, but, like, I go to a gay bar at one point and, I take myself out to a romantic dinner and I don't have a boyfriend at the time. So I kind of think about how nice that would be. But it's not the focus of the story. And people have mentioned that sort of surprised them when they were reading it because they didn't know to expect that. But then they were like, oh, wow, you were already humanized to me because you were just this guy on this trip. And it's like, oh, somebody who can just be a guy on a trip can also be gay. That's interesting. And so I think it's nice where you can sort of like get it in there where people aren't necessarily expecting, because sometimes if they know going in, they might avoid the property because they're like, oh, that story's not for me, right? And then this is a way of saying, actually, everybody can just be for everybody.
While the state of things isn't all bad, there's clearly a long way to go before the comic book industry and related industries can consider themselves to be producing diverse, inclusive work. So what can the industry do better? How can it improve?
Hiring the people of these marginalized groups that they're trying to represent, and having open dialogues and asking the questions on how to better represent these marginalized groups in comics.
Start from the top in putting women in executive positions and highlighting women and promoting women and paying women.
Hiring people who are queer, who are trans, who are people of color to write their own stories.
If the industry had more funds to pay more creators who are queer to tell queer stories.
They should hire people who look more like the diversity that actually exists in the country and in the world. people from different locations, people from different religions, people of different races, and hire more queer people so that they can tell all kinds of stories and then have a rich, diverse cast in their books.
Continue to hire the right people for the right jobs. I always advocate for having the best artists available, and if there is somebody that represents the characters, the interests of that character, is the best.
Hiring more queer people to write and create their work. I think in a lot of cases, you still have a lot of white, cisgendered, straight people writing stories.
It'd be super cool if there were more brown people hired to write brown people, and queer people hired to write queer people, and trans people hired to write trans people, and people who have different lived experiences than the standard issue Cape book writer might have. From their perspective is going to be different, and they're going to bring a certain kind of knowledge to the table that, quite frankly, unless they are extraordinarily empathetic and really sit down and really do their research and hire sensitivity readers and just go the 100th mile to make sure that everything they're doing is on point as possible, the average white, cis, straight, male, 25 to 49-year-old writer is going to do.
The answer then is clear and not at all surprising. The key to making truly diverse comics, or really any form of art or media, is to diversify the teams of people that are making it. When queer people and brown people and trans people and people representing other diverse groups are all involved in the creation of stories, that's when you'll start to see good stories about these people. The comic industry and related industries could be so much better than they are now. It's not that the stories they're making now are bad, it's just that they're so limited. After all, there are many more people in the world besides straight, white, cisgender men. Why shouldn't the stories we read reflect that reality? In the end, the success of queer stories in comics is up to the audience. Supporting the artists, writers, and publishers who create these stories goes a long way. Take it from the artists, writers, publishers, and fans you've just heard from. If those are the stories you want to see, then those are the stories you should be buying.